And in many cases, countries were colonized directly or indirectly. So that we've seen this kind of thing before, and this is really the same kind of history that we had in Vietnam, except in a different part of the world. So I talked about the French. Remember, I talked about the French colonialists in Vietnam, who were sort of like they wanted a colony, and then they wanted raw materials, and then they wanted rubber, right? And they started the Michelin plantations and so on. Well, by the same token, people start to pay attention to the Middle East because there is oil. So, for instance, the fight over Iran came about because the duly appointed premier, who was Mohammad Mossadegh, sometimes Mossadegh, I'm sure I'm pronouncing this incorrectly. So, if you're an Arabic speaker, please forgive me. My lousy. I'm a non-Arabic speaker, so I know that these are supposed to be pronounced back in the throat. And I'm terrible with languages too. So it's like, so please just suffer along. But Mohammad Mossadegh was this very unusual leader in the 50s, and he refused to grant British Petroleum, BP, and you may have seen their logo, I'll put it up here, the oil contracts that it wanted, because BP had been holding on to oil contracts in Iran up to that point. And Mossadegh got into power, and he was like, that's the end of that. We're going to be doing business with the new boss, meet the new boss. And he was duly elected. I mean, this was a democracy. It was a democratic election. Well, the British were like, no. So they went to their pals, and in 1953, the United States backed Reza Shah, Shah, and they overthrew Mossadegh and his followers and forced the Shah into power. So we're going to see this played out in Cuba. It's going to be played out in Iraq, and it's going to be in Iran, in Algeria, you name the colony, basically, either the United States or the Brits or the Dutch or somebody, the French, the Germans, somebody's going to be in there knocking over some kind of government to put in their own government so they can own the resources or own the colonies. So this wasn't about democracy, because there already was democracy in Iran. I mean, if people are like, oh, Iran is such a big problem, it's like, you want to have a democratic Iran? There was one. 70 years ago, there was a duly democratically elected Iran. They just wanted home rule. Oh, what a shock. What they wanted to be able to actually decide that they could do for themselves. They wanted to be able to do that. Even we Canadians wanted, nice, polite, apologizing Canadians want to do that. And in 1980, Trudeau, the older Trudeau, the dad, went off to Britain, and he was like, "Give us our constitution." And the Brits were like, "Oh, very well. Here you go, you damn colonialists." And there came Chrétien back with the Constitution. Oh, we have the Constitution now. It's like, okay. So it was a big deal for us, right? So why would other people be different? Well, because they're brown people. And as we know, following social Darwinism, brown people just don't know what they're doing. They're not as bright as white people because we run the show. And we run the show because we're the best. And we're the best because we run the show. It's just tautology. It's circular reasoning. Okay. So this was the deep irony of what happened in Iran. And it's hardly a surprise that at the point that the Shah fell or was deposed, that there was a massive revolution in Iran. It's not surprising. You can't put a lid on a boiler. This is to go back to this metaphor. You can't put a lid on a boiler and have no pressure escape. You put a lid on a boiler, and things are going to be okay for a while, and you're going to have to start using force to keep people in line, and then you're going to have to start torturing people, and then you're going to have to start, and then boom, right? And that's what happened. So this is also partly why the British came to create Iraq after World War I, a country which was formed of various different regions of what is still known as Mesopotamia, which really means the space between rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, two big rivers in the region. And so this Mesopotamia, middle, right? It's the middle. as with the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, down at the very south of Vietnam, which is this incredible, huge delta where the Mekong River comes all the way through Vietnam, and then it opens out into this floodplain. And the floodplain is low and flat and stable. And so it's incredible farmland, right? Because the river has been washing down here for centuries and brings with it soil. And the soil that stays is the heavy soil, which is rich and great for growing. Well, the same thing is true with the space between the rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Always pay attention to river valleys, because river valleys make for alluvial plains, what are called floodplains. And these are the richest farmland. For instance, Toronto is built on this kind of land. And this is the irony about most contemporary cities, is that they are built on the best farmland. The biggest cities that we have, because they're the oldest, are probably built where the farming was originally the best. And the city grows and grows and grows and grows and takes over more and more farmland. So that's not a good idea at all. At any rate, so at the end of the 20th century, now I'm there, it's now 1980, and Iran is a newly created state. In 1979, basically, the Shah of Iran, Reza Shah, is deposed, as they say. And there's a revolution and this deposition of the Shah, and Iran has taken hostage 66 Americans at the U.S. Embassy. And it holds these hostages between 1979 and 1980 during an election in the United States, right? Because it's election year, 1979, just like it is now, and it's an odd year, right? And it's election year, and the struggle is between Carter, Jimmy Carter, who was still alive at this moment and still working for Habitat for Humanities, and has proved to be an elder statesman, a very fine leader, a real humanitarian. He brokered a peace, like it or not, he brokered a peace between Egypt and Israel during his during his stay in office. A peace which has sustained. It's still in existence. And so between Carter and Reagan, right? And Carter, so these 66 individuals are taken prisoner, and they're kept by the Iranians, and they are held for 444 days. And it makes Carter look bad. And Reagan says, oh, we won't do that. We're going to go to war with Iran. And people are like, yeah, now that's the America we remember, even though they are 5 years out of Vietnam. It's only been 5 years since Vietnam. But remember that there's this big cultural fight about how Vietnam got lost. Who lost Vietnam for us? And the right wing is convinced that the left wing stabbed it in the back, right? I talked about this. And remember when I was talking about Rambo? Maybe you don't, but anyway, that's what I was doing. And so this stab in the back resulted in the loss of Vietnam, which they could have won. And the right wing begins to propagate this belief that they could have won. We Americans, that is America, could have won in Iraq, in Vietnam, if only they had been allowed to fight with the gloves off. And so Iran, for various different reasons, holds these hostages until it sees that Carter is going to lose, and Carter then does lose the election. Reagan is elected, and Iran releases the prisoners. And it's just a disaster. Given that Iran was unstable, Saddam Hussein, you're wondering, like, how the hell, like, why are you telling me all this history? Well, remember that Iran and Iraq are neighbors, right? They're right beside each other. So let me show you the map again here to remind you, right? So have a look at this map. So, my printer. My printer has a starring role in many of these lectures. Jesus. Okay, so Saddam Hussein, who has been the president of the elected Ba'ath Party in Iraq, attacks Iran in 1980 because he and Khomeini, who comes in as the new boss in Iran, which is now a religious state, an Islamic state, are enemies, and because of the different kinds of Islam, and so they go to war. And Iraq and Iran are at war for 8 years, between 1980 and 1988, and it is a bitter, grim war. I mean, it's just terrible, and really, it's very little covered in American papers, barely in the Canadian papers, mostly because there are no white people involved, so there's not a lot of interest. It's fairly basic. The concern is what is going to happen to the oil, because both these nations are sitting on top of big pools of oil. So the United States is like, hey, we're not fond of this. Now we have this Islamic, as far as they're concerned, Islamic nutcase who is in charge of Iran, and they've got somebody who they're not fond of who's in charge of Iraq. But of the two, he's better looking. So this 8-year-long war that goes on between these two countries pretty much ruins the economies of both countries during this time. Saddam begins to use state money to buy weapons, and Iran pretty much throws people into the war because they're blockaded by the United States. Because the United States is like, well, the Shah was our guy. We lost the Shah. We're not for this Islamic guy, whoever this person is, this Ayatollah Khomeini. What is an Ayatollah anyway? So, and Iran, in fighting the war, begins to use children, and so basically it becomes a border war, and so along this long border between Iraq and between Iraq and Iran, there is a contested border zone, and it gets to the point where its children are getting killed. I mean, they're 14, 15-year-old boys on both sides. And it's bad, as I say. But nobody stops it. I mean, they're like, let them fight it out. Let them kill each other. It's fine. And during this time, Reagan and his cabinet support Iraq fighting Iran, right? Because this is the choice. It's like the evil of two lessers, as Michael Moore would say. Or really, it's the lesser of two evils, that basically, largely Saddam is nominally in favor of a free market. Utterly, I mean, he's a dictator, and he looks like a likely ally in the Middle East. So it's like, if somebody's going to support, if you're going to make common cause with somebody, it's going to be Saddam, and it's not going to be the Ayatollah Khomeini. That's for sure, because the Ayatollah has been in exile in Paris, in France. And he has learned to hate the West in this time, and so he's not making deals with anybody. He's like, no, we're going to, and if people say to us, you can't have this and this and this, he's like, that's all right, we don't need it anyway. We're going to do without, we're going to run things locally, and we'll do things our way, and that Shah, he's finished. That's all over. Okay, so at this point, let me show you a little clip, which is very famous, or very infamous, as they say. Famous and infamous. Okay.